I
This
do, but
conference will now be recorded.
Oh,
I need just a second to grab the link before I make my announcement. So
sure. I
just a
can actually, I have an announcement. It will just maybe something to share out. This past week, last Friday, we had our first Eastern Shore of Maryland Youth Climate Summit, Youth Environmental Action Summit in partnership with the Ward Museum, which is they do waterfowl decoys and wildlife art, and actually and NOAA with a NOAA affiliate, Elise Trelligan, who I met 3 years ago through the UL Innovative Education Awards. So there was about 150 students that were there, grades 3 through 12. They presented and awarded over 50 projects with funding ranging from like $20 to $1,200, depending on the projects, and had a variety of really great presentations from all sorts of organizations and groups and partners that came together for that day. And actually, I think she would make a great presentation for the clean call at some point, Katie or Patrick. I can connect. If you don't know Elise, I can connect you to her. But anyway, it was a really, really good event, and they're already planning for 2020. So it's great.
That's great.
Yeah, it was great.
And yeah, it'd be great to have her present. That's a good idea. Maybe connect, Patrick and I with her.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
And then also I know that the AGU deadline is coming up really soon. Isn't that like next week?
Yep, it's on the 17th, Wednesday. For those who weren't on these calls, we had a couple of calls talking about a lot of different conferences, including AGU. I can put the link to the document we sort of used to coordinate everybody, and we tried to get everybody in contact with people in terms of who was interested in doing what, but we have some groups working to get the AGU proposals submitted for the climate literacy focus sessions. And we determined we were going to do about 5 of those this year, and then we're also still trying to organize our workshop. So I can find please excuse my screen sharing is going to change here, but the link to this document, and if you're interested in joining the second session, or the second tab down here is AGU. So get in contact with some of the people that are listed as conveners for each of these 5 sessions. If you're interested in joining one of them and you missed out on that, I think from what I know, people are working on getting submissions ready and nobody's actually done one yet. So reach out if you're interested in joining, but otherwise I think we're pretty well set in terms of getting these in next week. So
yeah, and I actually I'm in charge of the workshop, getting everybody on the same page about that. So I will get that email. I'll get that happening this week.
Great.
And if anybody else is interested in being on the workshop, if you want to just send me a chat message, I can, or just let me know now. We can get you added to that coordinating space. We need to have a call like probably this week. Actually, we have quite a lot to figure out to get that submitted on time.
Yeah, and definitely include Anna and Frank on that, just because I know they've been in contact with the education folks about how we're doing, because it's changed a little bit how AGU structured the workshops this year. So they've been in contact about how to do that.
And is NSTA this week?
Yeah, so Frank's at NSTA this week. Anna's around, I'm sure he'll respond to email, but yes, he is technically at that conference.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other announcements?
Yeah, this is Patrick, and I just wanted to mention that the Inside the Greenhouse Comedy and Climate Change short video competition is open for entries here for about another week. And that's through Inside the Greenhouse, which was co-founded by Max Boykoff and Beth Osnes, who have both presented in recent months, along with Rebecca Saffron here at CU. So if Max and Beth inspired you, please submit a video, just up to 3 minutes in length, and you can find more details on the link.
Great, thank you. Any other announcements? No? Okay, so we'll get started with today's presentation.
Actually, sorry, one more. You mentioned this, but NSGA is this week. If anybody's there, we have a document also that's the climate literacy sort of related stuff happening at NSGA. This is also posted in the newsfeed on the Clean homepage, but just so y'all have this document if you want it, it's in the chat. Thanks, sorry.
No, sure, thank you. So this week's call is going to be focused on a new book that's being written by Dr. Joe Henderson and Dr. Andrea Drewes, Teaching Climate Change in the United States. And Joe is a continuing lecturer in the Department of Environment and Society at Paul Smith College of the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and a neighbor of mine, so I'm really happy to be introducing him actually, where he teaches courses in the environmental social sciences. He is trained as an anthropologist of environmental and science education, and his research investigates how sociocultural, political, and geographic factors influence teaching and learning in emerging energy and climate systems. Dr. Andrea Drewes, am I pronouncing that right, Andrea?
Yep, just Drewes, like rhymes with cruise. Yep.
Okay, Drewes is an assistant professor. Yeah, sorry about that. Assistant professor of education at Cedar Crest College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses in teacher education. She's trained as a learning scientist, and her research is focused on teacher preparation for climate change instruction and student learning outcomes in climate science education. So please welcome them, and they're going to share a little bit about this, the book that they're working on. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
This is Katie. I'm just going to jump in here really quick for the people who might be watching a recording of this. Our speakers today were wanting to keep these documents not out circulating on the world, so we didn't post these on our website. We are sharing them today on the screen, which you can see, but if you were interested in looking at them, they mentioned that you could contact them and reach out to them to try to get a copy of this if you were interested. So just gonna throw that out there.
Yeah, and I will say too, Katie, I was able to get, so I'm on the phone right now, but I'm also looking at you all on the GoToMeeting. So I have the documents pulled up. If you want to share my screen as I talk, we can kind of go back and forth. I don't know if that makes sense.
Do you want me to just change it to you to be
maybe that
presenter, and then you can share your screen, just because as you talk through it, that might be a little easier if you have
I think that's right. So people can kind of see what we're talking about, and I can go back and forth through different parts, and then if we do that. So yeah, that just came through. Can you see that?
Yep, it's coming up now.
Okay, so you see me moving this document up and down?
I don't see it moving. I just saw it come up. Can you try it again?
I see it moving.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So just as long as it's dynamic. So, and if there are any issues, just let me know. So, so Andrea, I'm going to start and kind of run through a couple of things, and then feel free to jump in if there are things you want to add, and I can turn it over to you. And you should talk a little bit about your work as well, and kind of how we've come at this project. Does that sound good?
Sure thing.
Okay, so first, I guess, thank you for having us. It's been a while since I've been on a clean call. I tend to teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so it's hard for me to make these calls all the time. But so just know that I appreciate talking this stuff through. I think we were thinking that this would be somewhat more of a conversational presentation, and so I'll give you some background, and then Andrea can add some stuff that she's kind of currently working on and how she sees this, because Andrea and I are both in slightly different educational communities, and so we can talk about those as well. But just to start kind of way back at the genesis of this project. So Andrea and I first met each other. She was a doc student and I was a postdoc at the University of Delaware, working on one of the CSEP projects, the Made Clear project, if people are familiar with that. So this is how we kind of know each other, working off of those things. So, you know, data collection, presentations, publications, all of that stuff, some of which is still continuing, and I guess now merging into this form. So I tend to see this project as kind of coming out of a couple of key things, and I'm going to actually blame Frank for some of this. You know, I joined the CSEP project as it Made Clear as it was winding down, and so it was kind of like thinking through how do we end this thing and move forward. Like, what is it that we're actually producing? So many of the projects produced a lot of empirical, peer-reviewed journal articles, and
Oh, Joe, we lost you.
Oh no.
Uh-oh.
Did we lose it? Look, I don't see a caller one anymore. I think we might have dropped the call completely.
Is he still talking to himself though now? That's
I hope not.
Probably.
Oh, he just lost his phone service. Nope, he realized it. So I'm sure he'll call us back.
okay.
Or if Andrea wants to jump in and try to fill in if she
Yeah,
can.
I can. I'm not exactly sure where he was going, but I'm happy to start. But yeah, so yeah, Joe joined our Made Clear project at University of Delaware, and we were both stationed at University of Delaware. University of Maryland was also a big partner in Made Clear, along with a number of other institutions across the states of Delaware and Maryland, predominantly. I kind of came on the project as a doc student, like the after the first summer, and you know, this book, where we were trying to head with it. Oh, is he still? No, I'll back it. Sorry, I saw his the name on the screen, but yeah, I'm not exactly sure how he was planning on introducing this, but from my perspective, as we were going through the project and really starting to, you know, come out with these publications in peer-reviewed journals, and it just felt that sometimes we were doing what I personally feel, and I know Joe and I have talked about it, that the world of educational research sometimes does a little bit of navel gazing, where we're very concerned with what exactly we are doing. Oh, maybe he's come back. And so what we were trying to do is to make this book more so a partnership between practitioners and researchers, and not just be oriented for researchers. Joe, have you joined us?
yeah, so one of the joys of living in a rural area is that when it rains a lot, the infrastructure tends to struggle. So sorry about that. My call got totally dropped. So Andrea, I was listening to that, and that was actually pretty useful.
Oh, okay.
So I guess, do you want me to pick kind of up there?
Yeah, go for it. Since I wasn't exactly sure how you were planning on introing it, so I just kind of
no, let's come back around. The last thing I heard was your kind of research and practice thing, and so I'll actually weave that back in. So I guess I was on like the CSEP projects coming to an end, right? I was interested, I think, and we were having a lot of conversations. Pat Harcourt and I were continually talking around like, how are we synthesizing some of these things into a body of work? Like, what is the body of work in climate change education? Because to me, it's always seemed, and I would love to hear other people's opinions on this when we talk about this later, but it just seems like there are people kind of working on this issue in lots of different little areas, many of them marginalized from other fields. And there hasn't really been anything to make them coherent or to bring them together. And I think there's a number of us, just junior scholars, who communicate about this stuff and say, like, look at this emerging research, look at this emerging research. Like, there's no kind of coherence around it. And I think part of what we wanted to do here was to just produce an artifact out of these projects, to see if there would, so that we could kind of create a historical artifact. Like, here's what we learned from doing these CSEP projects. When I approached the other projects in my kind of last year at Delaware, some of them were interested in it, some of them were not. I think a lot of people were kind of moving on to other projects, and so bringing them together into a coherent whole was difficult. I was approached by a publisher at a conference, Routledge, who said, look, we would really like to publish something like this. Can you pull this together? And at the time, it just didn't work out. We couldn't get enough people to kind of bring it together. So I moved, came up here, and kept thinking about how we need to kind of start creating some artifacts for the field of climate change education, specifically to do, I think, what Andrea was talking about. So part of it, and what we're trying to do here is to thread a needle between research and practice, so that there are practitioners who are hopefully doing projects that are based in kind of what we know about good research on this, but also to talk about kind of some of the successes and struggles that they're having. I think we're really interested, especially in this notion of like failure and struggle. Like, there are a lot of people who are doing a lot of work who are running into a lot of roadblocks, and some of them very serious roadblocks. And so talking about some of those things. And I think I had a conversation with Frank about this prior to the 2016 election, and he said, look, figure out what we're creating for the field of climate change education so that we don't have to continually reinvent the wheel, right? Like, in our and Andrea can probably speak more to this than I can, but in our work with teachers on professional development, like, what I encounter more than anything is a lot of teachers who are looking, and I'm using this word very broadly, right? Educators who are looking for information around how do they actually do this kind of education in their classrooms, in their museums, in their town councils, right? So we're thinking, and as an anthropologist, I think about education very broadly here, and I'll show you how that plays out in terms of the structure of the book as we currently envision it. But I think we're trying to essentially put down a marker and say, like, here are some people that are doing interesting work in the Adirondacks, in the United States, despite a lot of challenges and a lot of currents that are actively pushing against them, right? So Routledge accepted a book proposal, and it's actually out of their UK office for a climate change series. So this is not really even an educational series. But when I was speaking to the editor from Routledge, they were essentially like, can you please explain to us what the heck is going on over in the United States? Like, what's your deal? And I was like, we'll try. So I think this book is written both for people in the United States who are looking for models and research to go from, but also as a way of explaining kind of what are the issues in the United States in particular, given our kind of anomalous political context. So, I mean, I think that's kind of some of the framing. So we started by inviting some of the CSEP projects, people that we knew were doing good work. We reached out to a bunch of people that we knew, did a kind of like what's called snowball sampling. Basically, you know, who are the leaders in this? Who should be in this book? And you know, not everybody was able to be, just because everybody's busy. So what you see and what I'll show you now is this a kind of working table of contents. So you can see some of the people, and right now we have it split into just kind of various sectors or contexts of education. So there's the kind of institutional formal education, there's the informal museum and like the Wild Center, some of the stuff that goes on around climate generation, and then also the kind of community-based and non-formal education. I don't think we're married to this organizational scheme, but it was just a way for us to make sense of who was doing kind of what and what were the different contexts. I think we may reorganize this depending on what the chapters look like. So we tried to also think about this in a way that was diverse. So we tried to engage people around things like Indigenous education. We tried to think about it in terms of online education. But also looking at kind of diverse contexts as well. So both diverse peoples and contexts. So some of this is like, you'll see some work going on in conservative spaces, some work that are going on in more progressive states. There's another motivation for doing this, I think, which is that in our, like, I used to and kind of still do on the margins, like, AERA is having their conference. They're wrapping it up right now, the American Educational Research Association conference. There's very little climate change education work being done there. It's very marginalized within this organization, which is one of the largest academic organizations in the world. So we can get into this and why some of the reasons why I think this is happening, but they're just, for whatever reason, I don't think climate change has really risen to a level of an object of concern among many of the people who are working in that field. This is probably one of the most frustrating things I'll say on this call, but back during my postdoc, a bunch of junior authors, we pitched essentially a research conference, or basically like a research project. So the American Anthropological Association, the American Sociological Association, they all have impaneled working groups around climate change and have produced reports that are essentially like, here's what we know in sociology about climate change. Here's what we know in anthropology about climate change, and here's what needs to be done. That's, to my knowledge, has never been done in kind of the largest educational organization. We actually pitched a small grant to do a kind of research workshop to produce something like this. And some of our feedback was, you guys are too junior to pull this off. Essentially, all of the scholars who are emerging scholars, extremely concerned about this issue that the rest of our field is not concerned about, that we were too junior. Super frustrating experience to go through. So I think, I see this in some ways as an artifact that can be used to bring this into some of the more educational research-oriented spaces as well. Frustratingly so. I'm very frustrated about that, to the point where I don't really engage some of those anymore. So there's kind of that aspect as well. I think we pitched to Rutledge that we wanted this to be immediately released in paperback so that it doesn't just go die in a library somewhere. And they were very amenable to that, and they're very amenable to a kind of accelerated publication line. I think there's this realization that like there's work that needs to be out there and needs to be out there sooner than later. So we're moving kind of fast on this. We're in the process where we're starting to look, Andrea and I are starting to look at, review the initial chapters that have come in. Some of them are still coming in. So I think that's probably, I guess, a couple more things just in terms of framing. We're kind of explicitly not focused on, I know the name of this network is the Climate Literacy Network, but I think there's some people who are writing some things that are a little deeply suspicious of that idea, and we can get into that. But basically, like, how do you educate in a way that's bigger than just teaching individual people to alter their own kind of material implications, right? Like, climate change is one of these issues as a collective action problem that is going to require shifting structures and institutions. And so a lot of the chapters are about, like, if you think, I think Don is on this call, and, they're looking at, like, how do you actually shift a professional organization, right? Peter Buckland and Michael Mann, and I don't know their other co-author, but, like, how do you shift a town council to actually make impacts? So many of the projects are talking about education at scale, and I think in a very political way, but I don't mean that necessarily ideologically, but like thinking bigger than just education as solely an individual endeavor, right? So I know, Jen, the work that the Wild Center is doing around institutionalizing climate change education and training essentially a next generation of leaders. I mean, that's a good example of a project that is doing work at scale. And I think that's one of the things that we're really intentional about talking about here. So Because I think so much of my field of environmental education, there's this really naive idea that like we'll just teach people about the kind of basics of climate change and then they'll change behavior, and like that's not how it works. That's largely been a failure of the field for a long, long time. I mean, people are deeply embedded in social structures and institutions, and if you're not changing those, then I think I think it's a misallocation of analysis or of focus. So, Andrea, I don't know if you want to jump in on any more of that, and I can kind of scroll through some of the document while you're talking. If you want to talk about science education, some of your research and how you see it informing this.
I mean, I think you've given a good overview of where the book is going. I agree that I think one of the things that we're trying to look at is that, that bridge between practitioners and researchers and people who have been looking at teaching climate change in the United States in a variety of different ways. I don't know that I have anything specific to add to it right now. Yeah, I think if we're staying focused on the book, I think I'll let you, if there's anything else that you want to point out.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things like that we're trying to think too here is thinking bigger than just science education, even though many of us are kind of coming out of that. There's one of the reasons that the larger educational research community hasn't engaged here is that they see this very much as within the domain of science education. And so I've actually had people say this to me before, like, oh, we don't really need to think about that. It's like science education is dealing with that, right? And I just think that's really myopic, and also I personally think that like this maybe science education isn't necessarily the best place for some of this work at this point, right? Like I think what we really need are narratives around living differently, and I'm not sure that science can get us into the future land of oughts, right? Like science is very good. I'm thinking of David Hume here, right? Is very good at the is, like what is the nature of the world, but what ought we do? I mean, that's values and politics and culture and all kinds of stuff like that. So I think we're looking a little bit bigger here, even though some of it is certainly coming out of science education, because that's many of our backgrounds. So you'll see a lot of like just thinking about the titles of these papers, right? Social science, emotional learning, climate empowerment. You don't see a whole lot in these around literacy. It's about civic life and community engagement and like digital media accessibility and things like interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches. So that's kind of we're thinking about it that way as well. And you'll see actually when I can send these documents to people that are interested, but when we try to define the market, we're thinking very broadly here around who this is for, and trying to do it in a way that doesn't assume a lot of specialist knowledge, but yet also is empirically rigorous, right? So that people are citing kind of peer-reviewed published research and not just making things up out of whole cloth. So here's a sense of kind of what we're looking at. So I think we're not going to shy away from the controversial aspect of climate change. One of the things that Andrea and I are going to do in our introduction is talk about some of those issues and why people resist it and what that looks like in terms of the politics of education. So I think certainly the policy dimension is something that I know we were doing research on in Delaware, and like what in geography terms, it's a variegated pattern, right? Like climate change education looks very different in different states, and depending upon who your science teacher is or who your teachers are. So I think those are some of the things that we're trying to get at, some of those kind of points of friction, I guess. And as someone who's trained in anthropology, like this is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for like, where is knowledge resisted? How is it legitimated? How is it institutionalized? Who resists it and why? What are the kind of ethical implications there, which is more of a philosophical question. But I think one of the things, and maybe this is where we should just have some discussion, is just things that we should know about, things that we should think about as we go forward, things that we said that are resonant, that people want to talk about. I'm happy to, I think we're happy to share these documents if you want to send us some emails. So maybe, Jen, we could open it up to questions or discussion. I know you're writing a piece for this, so you could talk about that if you want.
Yeah, I think we should open it up to discussion and questions.
Okay.
I did notice that somebody put, Abby put into the chat that she was interested in having your email addresses to follow up after. And I don't know if others
Sure.
might be interested in something like that. Are you comfortable with putting those in the chat for people?
Sure, yeah. Andrea, I don't know if you are, but I can send it.
And this is Katie Boyd. So I have one question for you guys in terms of, I think this is a really neat idea and definitely something that needs to happen and be put out there. I'm somebody who came from the science and moved into more of the education research world, and I sort of agree that I feel like this is more of a fringe thing that should be made more mainstream, and I'm hoping can help. And I'm just curious, sort of like, yeah, where did you guys like what, you know, the original idea and sort of how you reached out to people? I mean, I know a lot of these people are also in our network here, but you know, just sort of the thoughts around kind of some of the different projects and people that are working on this, the different chapters for this. How did you guys kind of come to the things that you have here now?
Yeah, so I think to trace this lineage out a little bit, and Andrea, feel free to jump in here too, because my memory might be a little shaky. It's been a while since we actually wrote this thing, or like wrote the proposal. But initially, it was again, like I said, the genesis is some of it is coming out of the CSEP projects, and so you'll see a couple of chapters there from people like Billy Spitzer, who is working on those.
Right.
But also we pinged people who have been recognized before. So I think like our project, the Make Clear project, was one of the ones that was designated under the Obama administration as kind of good practice. And there are a couple of other ones like the Wild Center, for example.
Mm.
So some of it is just like people that we knew, and a lot of these were coming out of the Clean Network as well, right? Like that we knew were doing work in this area. Some of it though, and actually I know that there's a couple of people on the call. I don't know if they're still here, but yeah, Devarati. Like some of it is our junior scholars who are working in this area, and we wanted to say like, you know, you're a junior scholar out. I think she's in Nebraska or Oklahoma.
She's in
like,
Nebraska, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like we want to hear from you as well, right? So Fikeli Nuxamalo, who's at Austin, now going to Toronto, who's doing amazing work around indigenous, looking at issues of indigeneity and race in like elementary school classrooms around climate change, right? So I think there are Catherine Stevenson, who's a kind of junior faculty member in North Carolina. Some of it is also that like one of the issues that we're having as junior scholars is like publishing on this stuff. There are some journals where it's relatively easy for us to publish on this stuff: Environmental Education Research, Journal of Environmental Education, some of the science education journals, but very little of this stuff has broken into broader educational research journals. There's almost to the point like we got so frustrated with this that at some point we backed away from the empirical work, and I'll just show this reference here. But like we wrote a paper with some Canadian colleagues and David Long, who's at Moorhead State in Kentucky, basically just like, here are the issues, here's how you might engage in terms of educational research. Like I send that paper out to a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, this is a problem, but I don't really know what to do about it. I'm in literacy. And we're like, okay, like here's how you might think about this. Like people doing school architecture. There's very little research on school architecture. Like that's a thing that we mention in there. So it's I think that we see it in some ways as kind of trying to also give a platform for junior scholars who are struggling to work on this right now. But then also, you know, we invited a lot of people whose names aren't here, who just couldn't do it because of things like illness and jobs and busyness and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of people that I would actually love to have had on this, but you know, you gotta go with what you have. And I think we still have quite a bit here that are I think it's a broad kind of diversity at least.
Yeah, I'll just say from my personal experience, I really appreciate that you went through, like you said, I know you've sort of organized it this way here, but that you really seem to include all the different audiences and places where education happens. Because I feel like some of the, you know, books that are focused on trying to help teachers teach about climate change, you know, really focus on formal education. And then there's other places that really focus on the informal space. And so it's nice to really see it kind of come together, because I think, you know, we all work in these organizations that are in these places, but we overlap and we collaborate and we do all these things that mixes up those kinds of audiences and environments. And I like that you've included all of that together in one place.
Yeah, and I think, you know, like I have training in anthropology of education, and Andrea has training in learning sciences, and both of those fields, I think, are better than some of the narrow disciplinary fields at thinking about education as a thing that kind of exists in lots of places, and it's about kind of how cultures pass themselves along and remake themselves anew, right, and like reproduce themselves. So I tend to think of education as different than schooling, and I think that's I hope that kind of comes out, at least in terms of some of the framing, because I think one of the issues is there's actually a real like pragmatic issue here, which is that like altering school systems is something that takes long amounts of time. And if you take some of the climate science seriously, we don't actually have a ton of time on some of these things. So like, as I'm very passionate about a long-term kind of educational, like schooling project, in some ways it may be more important that you educate your town board, or that if you think about what's going on in Minnesota, right, like that you educate your governor. It's like, if you want to really think about where the power to shift a society is, schools are one place, but that's a long-term thing. Children, I think, are owed this knowledge given the importance of this in their lives. But we got to think about this in a more kind of complex way. So that's conceptually how we're shaping it as well.
Joseph and Andrea, definitely want to encourage, don't be, as you haven't been discouraged if you're on the more junior side. Your book is going to be extremely interesting for us to read. We were more in the range of 20 years ago to 10 years ago, in that range of tracking what is going on in education on climate change, not just science, but humanities, every field, as broadly as possible. That kind of became overwhelming for us, but that was, you know, to track it and kind of have a record of what was being taught between 10 and 20 years ago. So this is going to be great to see, and to see what you select and don't select. Is it fair to say that the Made Clear website is going to be a bit of a preview, a little bit of what's on your radar? I mean, we see things there. We also see some things that are kind of missing and weak or very light, and we're not sure how that went to be. But I mean, it's a well put together website with great web sources. That is that?
Yeah, and I think kind of. I mean, Andrea, do you want to talk about that paper that we published in the International Journal of Science Education? Because I think that paper gets at, and I can send this paper along too if people are interested, but some of the strengths and limitations. We did a conceptual analysis of our professional development and how it was translating over into student learning. And so, Andrea, I don't know if you want to speak about that, but like the strengths and limits of the Made Clear project.
Right. Yeah, certainly. So in reference first to the website, so Made Clear was, as most of you are probably aware, just this very large project and different parties within Made Clear were responsible for some of the different parts. So like, honestly, I have to go and look and see what's on the website again. And so there are some components that like Joe and I certainly had a hand in, and there are some components that other people affiliated with Made Clear got on there. But yeah, so the article that Joe was referring to, what we did is we really tried to examine one of our academies, and we had done the academy several times at that point, but in exploring from our perspective, from Joe and Chrisala Musa and I, who were authors on the paper, was really trying to examine what were the big ideas that we were covering. And this was kind of done in conjunction with research and work that we had been doing with the University of Maryland for the broader Made Clear project, which really was focusing on the development of a learning progression related to climate change, and kind of identifying those four big ideas of the mechanism, the actual effects that we're going to be seeing from climate change, how humans have an impact, and then mitigation and adaptation efforts as the kind of the four big constructs. And so those were that then turned into the backbone for the learning progression, which took a very science ed traditional schooling type of approach, at least in my personal opinion, to the development of the learning progression. And what we were trying to do with the paper, the bit of the study that Joe was just referring to, is to really try to look at that and evaluate to what end, to what purpose did we have those four ideas, and did we really cover them all appropriately? Did we, or not even appropriately, but adequately? And what we found is that Joe kind of alluded to it, but with so much of the presentations and so much of the content of the effort of that particular Made Clear endeavor was focusing on the development of science content knowledge in the teachers, which is very, very, very important. As a former middle school science teacher, but also as a informal educator at the Bronx Zoo and for teacher educators for a long time, that's important, very important, but it's not the only thing to really talk about. And so getting to, especially with climate change, that is ought, kind of idea, and thinking about not just understanding what climate change is, but what ought we be doing about it. And that we kind of took a critical, not critical, but certainly a reflective perspective on our own professional development that we ran, that we felt that we could have been pushing even further on the mitigation and adaptation and thinking about the future and not just what's happening now. We felt that's probably the restrictions of our funding, the funding structure, and other policy. But yeah, Joe.
Yeah, no, that was really good, and I just pulled up the article so people can see the kind of reference. So can you guys see that? It's this is, I'm happy to send this along as well. So this came out last year, 2 years ago, I guess, in the Journal of International Journal of Science Education. So essentially looking at like those four constructs, and then how did teachers take them up, and how did that translate into what was done in the classroom, and then how did that translate into student learning? So we did this idea, we use this anthropological idea of conceptual mobility, right? That some concepts move and are salient and other ones don't. And we essentially found that and this is really data rich and you should spend some time with it, but I'm just zooming to the findings, right? Yeah, so here's the one that I think is really interesting for us to think about, right? So we essentially that a lot of climate change education has been focused around, at least initially, and maybe this has changed. I would like to, hopefully it's changed, but there are a lot of people who are trying to present it, and I think if you look at the early Made Clear site, it's very much, there's this big concern about dealing with people who are rejecting the science and thinking about how do we just present the science in an objective fashion, and that's important. I'm all for quality science education, but asking science teachers to teach science for the purposes of social change, I think is a huge lift. That's a heavy lift that a lot of science teachers are just not, having trained science teachers, I think you're asking them to take a kind of descriptive is and posit a future normative ought, right? And that's almost more in the domain of social sciences or social studies. And I think we talk about how our own project kind of avoided some of the future looking orientation, right? Like we focus so much on the causes and less so on like, what do you actually do about this, right? So NGSS, I think I have some concerns about it, but to its credit is more intentional about some of these things, and you can read this and kind of grapple with it too. But that's just something to think about, and I think something that we're very I think we're less interested in the like what are the scientific concepts that make someone quote literate in climate science, but more like what do you actually do to change it. And it strikes me that maybe I'm wrong here, but that the overall kind of social conversation that's going on in this country is moving away from this, like, is it or is it not happening, and what is it, to, okay, now what do we actually do about it? I'm sensing that kind of discursive shift. I don't know if other people are, but that's a really long way to answer your question. So.
This is Abby Rusky. Thank you for sending your email addresses, and I just sent a question also to just see if you guys would be willing to put some of the research you're referencing on the clean site associated with this presentation.
Sure, yeah, I mean, especially published stuff, I have no problem with that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I do a lot of work at sort of the intersection between the action in the world and the educational process, and broadly read, as you've referenced. And for sure, we're looking at we're all feeling that and seeing and living into this limited time frame that we as educators have to work in. So how does that change our practice and what we're going after collectively? And I applaud you with this, it's a lot of work to put together a book like this and to have a major publisher be running with it. So congratulations on that. And I'm really psyched that you brought in young scholars and you're addressing sort of broader audiences and stories around this. I guess my question is in this, need in this time that we're in to sort of close that gap relatively quickly, and to do that really in many different ways now. What's the big takeaway from this book toward that? And who would you orient that to? Like, who are you hoping is going to pick this up and run with what you have inside of the two covers?
So basically, who's the audience and what was the first part?
I guess it's, and this is, I don't know where this boils up in the book for you, but in your work as editors of this, what are you positioning for those of us who are either doing the scholarly work and or doing the work on the ground, that are really the big takeaways sort of for direction setting for bigger shifts in systems and policy that we need to have happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big takeaways, and it's something I mentioned earlier, and Andrea, feel free to jump in here, but I think the way you just framed that is really interesting, right? Like, how do you shift structures and policies and institutions and communities and kind of larger scale sociological entities? I think that's one of the big takeaways, right? Like, there are case studies in here of people who are working with state and within federal agencies, within state agencies, and then within kind of community and town municipalities, also within institutions. So I think there's a really intentional shift on our part to think about the issue of scale and doing things that are going to shift things at scale. And I know, like, Don is writing an article with a co-author on how do you change professional training organizations, right? So that new educators are coming up with a training in climate change education so that it isn't just like left out of many people's like teacher training, elementary teachers, for example. So I think we're very focused at the level of like larger scale operators and trying to reach them and tell stories to them. But also I think we're interested in the individual. Like I think about all of the educators of various kinds who say like, I want to do this. I just need resources and I need stories and I need to know that like there are things out there that can help me and that there are people who are seen as leaders who can help me with this. And here's a research basis, and also like that I'm going to struggle with some of these things. I think that's so I think we're trying to talk to a couple of audiences here, right? Like people who are doing the kind of institutional policy work, but also people who are policy actors and have to actually implement some of these things. So that's it. I mean, I think we've aimed for a pretty broad audience, and I think it's part of this Rutledge. One of the things I really like about Rutledge is that they are a big kind of international distributor, and so I'm hoping that it gets kind of out into the ether in big places. But you know, it's a book, right? It's a chapter book. I see this very much as one artifact among many that hopefully is useful for some people, and we'll see where it goes. I don't know.
Joseph and Andrea, a question on coming from experience over dealing with the obstacles for 20 years and then trying to find what are some ways around it. Do you see looking at how is climate being taught, and whether it be the humanities, science, solutions, and all these different things? So often, or we put a lot of emphasis on bringing resources to people who are generalists, K-12 teachers, maybe a staff person at a museum. Very important. We have to do that. About also that there are specialists, people who this is their specialty for years at a time of going into schools, going into the museums, going into the public. Do you have examples of programs and ways in which people specialize in this, and they can have the resources and the training and the background to then, you know, to do that from that perspective?
Yeah, I think you know, I'm thinking of Billy Spitzer's chapter here. I think there are people who have experience doing this kind of work who can speak to very particular audiences around some of these things, right? So Kelly's chapter with kindergarten classrooms, and I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do is making sure that we have enough coverage of contexts so that people who would pick this up could find something that speaks to their context in a kind of, I'm a qualitative researcher, right? So transferability, right? Like, can they transfer the story here over to their individual context and kind of make that connection? I think that's one of the things that we're interested in as well.
Well, in the follow-up, it's also kind of the connectedness. In working in Maryland, Delaware, Washington, D.C. recently for the AAAS conference, we were looking for who else is doing education on climate change, and looked to Maryland. We couldn't find you. We didn't find you, and it was actually Lainey who's in on this phone call. Kudos to bringing things together connected to a school, Lowell School in Washington, D.C., where the humanities teacher led the program where all these middle school students from the area taught climate change to thousands of people. The thing of connected, you know, how do we even connect the programs that is wonderful is made clear that specialize in this, that we're having trouble even finding each other.
Well,
right?
And I think
we're specialists looking for each other, we can't find each other.
I think, look, climate change is a giant coordination problem, and I think that and this is yet another example of that, right? There's some people know this history better than I do, but it's my understanding that when the CSEP projects were funded, there was supposed to be a kind of really intentional coordination activity going on to create essentially a nationwide network of climate change educators, very broadly defined. My understanding is that was backgrounded mostly for political reasons. So, I mean, I'm certainly sympathetic to what you're talking about, and I think it heartens me to hear that there are people in humanities classrooms doing this work. I love that. But yeah, this is it's an enduring challenge, and I think one of the there's a larger question of how do we build, what are the institutions that we're creating to deal with this kind of knowledge mobilization and coordination problem? What do we need to actually do? Like, this is actually a really helpful thing for me to think about and for us to think about, right? Like, we're talking about doing these things at scale. It's particularly difficult in the United States because we have a federal system of education policy. Federalist system, right? So it's done at the state level because of the Constitution. So what does that look like to coordinate these actions, at least in terms of public schooling at that kind of level around state policy? So I don't know that I have a good answer for you on this one. I mean, I think it would be amazing if there were some sort of coordination institution that could do this and share best practices at scale. But I mean, we can't even get educational research to take it seriously. So yeah, I mean, part of what we were trying to do just as junior scholars was to say, look, we need to coordinate ourselves so that we can start coordinating research in a way so that everybody isn't just kind of like working in their own little kind of stovepipe incentive structure. It's an issue even within the field of research. Everybody's kind of all over the place, and junior scholars are not really supported. And like, if you're doing interdisciplinary work, like, good luck finding a job. Or just good luck finding a job in academia in general right now. But it's especially when you're doing something that's marginalized, it's really, really interesting.
Well, maybe
sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
A very positive perspective. We're often we're kind of what we're talking about are people who just what is it? We don't give up, right? We're focused on it. We find the things. We find ways. We don't let it we don't stop. You're not being stopped because you're not senior. You're going to make this book. You're doing these things. The people who find the ways to get around all the problems and just fight it through. Find the ways to be successful, that we can link up and then bring along other people who are more the generalists and so on. But I mean, I think there's maybe there's a very hopeful thing about your book of, I think you're among those that are just fighting it through. We are getting education on climate change and finding a way around all the roadblocks.
I mean, I don't know about you all. I'm quite tired. It's like, this is tired. I'm starting. One of the reasons I didn't go to AARA this year is that it's part of it's burning me out, and that's a longer conversation. But it's frustrating. It's just frustrating work to do. But maybe that's the best work, is doing the frustrating work. I don't know.
Sounds like a topic for another call, actually.
Yeah, right.
Burnout among all of us working on climate change. I think, was there another, I know we're kind of at time, but I'm happy to keep the discussion going a little bit longer. I actually had a question, but I think there may be someone else had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to.
Yeah, and I can stay for about 10 minutes. I got to teach a class at 2:20, so.
Oh, well, I'll ask a quick question around, and maybe this is embedded in some of the other chapters, but around sort of climate justice and the work that we're finding actually with youth, that they're not separating out sort of climate change education and social justice, and especially, working with, frontline communities of color. Like, it all sort of is this very fluid thing when we're working with, the young people that we work with are constantly telling us this. And I'm wondering, like, how you see that emerging within the context of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that is certainly front and center in this, right? Is like, what does this look like in terms of the Jen, this is how I tend to conceptualize climate change, right, as an issue of kind of social inequity related to patterns of industrialization and colonialism. So it's like, I'm thinking about it in that kind of anthropological sense. So like, the more of that we have, I think the more useful it will be for people to kind of see some kind of struggles. I also think this is one of the ways, I don't think you can understand some of the roadblocks that people run into unless you understand social injustice and power. And so I think, in my opinion, there's a real naivete in a lot of science education around how this stuff works to shape education. Science education is slowly moving in that kind of direction, mostly because there's a lot of junior scholars who are starting to do this work. But yeah, I think it's great. I think we're not shying away from it. Please center that.
Yeah, I do think that, I think you alluded to this earlier in the call that, there is this issue that there's this perception that climate change education belongs in the sciences. And I know that like Climate Generations is doing some really great work to push it into the civic space but that it's also, that's from a formal education standpoint, but really it is an issue of social injustice and power and oppression and all these other pieces that are so critical. So I appreciate your comment.
Yeah. Well, and let me just plug one more thing. And I think since this has been officially announced, Ellie Walsh, who is again junior scholar at San Jose State University, just had a book accepted by Rutledge called "Equity and Social Justice in Climate Change Education." And I'm actually writing a chapter with a couple of other people in that book about like what is climate justice in Trump country? What does that look like? I'm thinking a lot about this right now.
Great, thank you. Any other last quick questions?
I'll throw out a quick list. I don't know if I can do it quickly.
Come on, Don, you can do it.
Well, a subtext has been, and maybe subtext is not quite the right label, but we've talked about how science education is not the sole place where this should be happening for a bunch of reasons, but we haven't said what I think is one of the most important reasons, and that's that we can't point at any advances in science education in my adult life that have actually improved outcomes of science capability, whatever, of students being able to meet the responsibilities of citizenship on any kind of broad scale. And man, that's important. And the reason I think that we don't talk about it are the same kinds of reasons that go into climate change denial. It's sort of the state of education denial. So I'll just throw that out.
Yeah, and I think, Don, I mean, you and I have talked about this since as long as I've known you, I think. Yeah. And I, there's this interesting philosophical question of what are schools for, right?
Yeah.
And I think, are schools for kind of reinforcing the norms of society or reproducing them or reinventing them? And you have to think about like what is science education for? I mean, I think there's a big philosophical founded question, but yeah, I mean, in some ways maybe we need philosophy of education people dealing with this issue, but that's a field that's been marginalized within education as everybody has become techno neoliberalized, if you want to use that word. It's that those are huge philosophical questions, and I think they get at the nature of what are we doing in schools. I'm very suspicious about. I hesitate sometimes about thinking that like schools are. We always lean on schools to solve the problems of society that we can't solve elsewhere, and that's they're one site of social action. There are many other sites of social action.
Yeah.
And it's what is science for? Is it for kind of understanding of how the natural world works? I think that's partially right, but why do you learn science? Hopefully to do things in the world, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, we are obviously this is a very interesting topic to all of us. We still have folks on the phone who are past time, but I think we should probably wrap it up. Joe and Andrea, thank you so much for presenting the book today and sharing kind of the framing and your research ideas and around it. And thanks for everyone for staying on the call and for being part of this discussion. And Joe put in the email addresses, I think, are in the chat. If you want, yes, they are from Andrea and Joe. If you want additional information and want to follow up with either one or both, And just thanks again for your time today, and thanks everyone on the call. Onward.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Everybody.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.